Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everybody, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Today I'm here with Francesco Cutolo. Francesco is at Klarna. Now, Klarna is an organization that has a design system. It's fairly mature. And what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit different. When we talk on this podcast, we usually are talking about people that are building design systems or have built a design system and kind of want to talk about their story of how to get there. And while it's not always rosy, it's usually something that exists inside of a well-supported organization that is intentionally growing its design system practice. In this case, we're going to talk about how you build a design system in the middle of a crisis. And so in the spirit of not letting any good crisis go to waste, Francesco's here to sort of talk about that story. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Chris.
So tell me about Klarna.
Yeah, well, I think by now lots of people knows Klarna. Like, it's one of the largest private fintech in Europe, and it's seen a huge growth in the past 3-4 years. Basically, like, due all the microeconomic shifts that happen in the world, in spring, Klarna, as many other companies, seen a huge restructuring on people, on also how we operate, especially on markets and products that we wanted to ship. So many things changed. And the design system was, I wouldn't say central in that. We are not that important in such a huge ecosystem like Klarna. But we definitely see a different attitude lean toward the systemic work and how our way to, and by our I mean my team, operates and advocate constantly for efficiency, for optimization, and try to reduce costs in terms of effort, resources, and try to connect in the dots and try to let people collaborate more to avoid overlaps. I mean, back in the days when a company is in a hyper growth mode, you see that overlapped, duplicated work or wasted work sometimes is not only allowed, it's even encouraged. Like so many startups or scale-ups, you see that, oh, that's okay doing like rebranding every 10 months, who cares?
Right. So you had this organization that you were part of that was this incredibly fast growing company that was, a fintech startup. Everything's going great. And then all of a sudden, the macros of your environment change. And you have this moment where you realize that the company needs to cut. And you're in this position where you have built this kind of way of working around the design system along with your team that is really integral to the overall success of the digital product. What did it look like before the news hit that there was going to be an operational reduction?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite in the sense that we tried at least to bring teams together or trying to create a shared direction that it was very difficult to achieve when you move crazy fast, when you have the pace that it's okay to do overlapped work, to do duplicated work, and maybe never set up a good strategy or a good vision when it comes to systemic thinking for the next 12 months, because you need to think about now, you need to think for the next quarter and try to enlarge and go horizontal, like new markets, new countries, So the previous iteration of the design system was highly technical and mostly on support to the teams. It wasn't something to anticipate the needs of designers and developers.
So it was all about, how do I build more product faster? Because you have all of this effort and energy going towards like, I need to go capture this market. I need to be in this vertical, or I need to be over in this other part of fintech. And the way you do that in the design system is by building a bunch of things that people can pick up and just run with.
Yeah, it was pretty much like that. And of course, it's still ongoing in the sense that we are still trying to get along and try to use the keyword of optimization, or the keyword for efficiency, in the sense that we, in a very paradoxical situation, now we are front and center of how we can move with the same speed and maybe ship even faster, but with less resources and less time, but with a more strategical thinking ahead of us.
Gotcha. So that's really what the change happened. So tell me about that moment when you're sitting there and you're realizing that the team you've built and sort of the way of working that you had been using for a fair amount of time at that point was pretty stable. Like, what went through your mind when you realized that you were about to face a pretty dramatic change?
Actually, it was not something that happened overnight, I have to say. It was mostly like we were doing some kind of short-term actions or trying to solving short-term problems with our eagle eye perspective, because sitting in a design system, you always, like, we tried to put our hands and our feet in what was happening in different teams, in different units. So we basically, it was easier for us to get buy-in or be listened when it comes to, please slow down on this side. We have to clean it up a little better, this thing or this other thing. Then again, the buy-in was easier to get, and it was easier and easier the longer we were like, put yourself, make our way into the product. And on the other side, of course, on the higher floors of the company, and I would say in the general landscape of the digital industry, things were changing. So then again, I don't think it was an actual cause and effect situation, but it was more like two timelines that started to overlap in the right timing, I guess, and something that happened quite gradually, I have to say.
So, talk to me a little bit more about that buy-in. So, when you talk about having buy-in that really allowed you to make the changes to the design system to support this kind of new operational landscape of the business, what did that buy-in look like? Like, how did you build that clout that allowed you to really, maybe not effortlessly, but it seemingly without a lot of friction, make a lot of change to the way the design system operated?
I will start from afar with a nice story. This is a metaphor or an example that I use in different places in several occasions. Like every medium article about design system, or maybe the majority of them, they always start from the same premise, the premise that you're doing something from scratch. When you think about how many articles we read about color systems or color scales, they always start with the premise that you're starting from scratch. You're doing like the grayscale and all the functional colors, the non-functional colors from scratch. And this is something that happens very, very rarely. And put this in a real situation, like a team starts to create new screens or new patterns with a different background. Like we are going from a white background to a gray background. And that thing got validated, and more teams, they start to copy paste that thing because it works, and they try to stay consistent with that new thing that you never systemize, or your design system never, it doesn't support that. So if you just open then again, an article or a book or something, like the most popular thing that you get is that, yeah, you start to redoing the entire color scale, like test the accessibility. Maybe you redo the entire grayscale with hue, saturation, luminance, color modes, whatever.
Sort of ignores the reality of what's already out there in product.
Yeah, it's about timeline. Like to do something like that, of course, it takes 3 to 4 months. Like it takes a full quarter to redo the entire colors, distribute them, like stress test them on a larger scale, especially for a company the size of Klarna. Something like this will never get the buy-in you need. So you have to figure it out, something that works now. It works in the span of a couple of sprints or maximum amount of work. And you try to patch the leak on that thing and that thing only. And this is something that we did on a regular basis for almost a year, like so many little creases like that. And this is something that get us the buy-in that you asked me. So it was a very long answer.
Yeah, so you brought the ability to have these real immediate solves for pain. And those real immediate solves for pain, like they weren't like, let's go re-architect the design system, or let's go re-architect color, or rethink the way that our app should function at a core level. It's, hey, we have this very particular need. And if we're able to provide this quickly, it'll show up as being valuable right away. How did you go about identifying those things? Were those brought to you, or were those things that, you had folks on your team or inside the organization that were UX professionals or engineers saying like, hey, if I just had this, like, how did people surface those?
I'm not gonna lie, this is something that took us almost a year, and luckily, and this is like the best bit of luck that we got, is that we started doing this even before the entire crisis or reorganization. Like almost 2 years ago, we started from the fact that the discovery of these new things, or the discovery of what product teams were doing, was very like passive. It was something like, oh, by chance or by luck, I just discovered that this team is working on something completely new that probably, if it's going to pass, if it's going to be validated, it will be a major shift in a huge part of the user experience. And it was very passive. We worked for almost a year on trying to turn around the situation and get us, as I said before, like get our eyes and our feet into product teams and try to create routines that helped us to get visibility of what's going on into the product. We started from a situation where we didn't have any visibility, especially of some core products.
So how did you go about making that change? Because this sounds like really the crux of how you were able to adapt in the crisis was just this real good understanding of what your product needed.
We are not here to do design police, or we are not here to constrain you with design system. The classic mindset that, when a design system doesn't get that traction that you want, people start to see design system not as enablers, but, as a constraint for creativity, for pacing, for your OKRs, whatever. So we just started to put ourselves in a position that we just wanted to see what is going on. So please involve us in what's happening, and creating some kind of, I like to call it like fake official announcements, or fake routines, in the sense that, oh, we're going to have design system reviews, or we're going to have like office hours. So please book some time with us so we can see what you're working on. And those kind of routines, they felt as official things that the teams was doing. So, with the help of design operations, or with the help of the group of people that you can surround yourself, the famous design system advocates or ambassadors, there are multiple ways to call it. And yeah, so it's very people based. Most of the actions that we did were just manually and people based.
So you went from this sort of world where everything was fast and furious. It was build, 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 build. And then all of a sudden it was this shift. And I guess all of a sudden is the wrong way of putting it. Over time, during this crisis, it shifted towards not just like build for building's sake, but really to think strategically based on your knowledge of the products and your window into what the products were really needing, into this very, very tactical implementation of things that provided value immediately. Talk to me about that balance between strategy and tactics, because you're still shipping, you're still trying to deliver on these incremental bits of value, but in a very different way. And how did you balance that need for real tactical wins inside the organization and the buildup of that clout and buy-in with the overall strategy of where the design system was headed?
There is this Italian saying that I use a lot, and I don't think the translation it gives the right importance. But in Italian, we say like it's singing and carry the cross at the same time. So basically, it's like it refers to during like when Jesus carried the cross on his shoulders, and is making a sacrifice, is doing the heavy work, and he cannot sing. So this is something that people in the crowd does, and you cannot do both at the same time. And it's literally a situation where we need to fix some very short shitstorms at the same time. We need to squeeze our time, like we need to use the other half of our time to prepare the plan for the long term. The example that I did before on gray backgrounds or very small things, or maybe some visual assets work, or even just restart some things with the brand and product is still quite disconnected on the communication point of view. So doing some little works that just get you visibility, authority, and the mandate. And at the same time, when you finally have access to that room, you can sit at the table of maybe some critical work like that. You maybe have already something ready to show them what's your long-term plan. And they say, oh, okay, so you know what you're doing. And I'm talking, of course, to have a model ready, or design system networking ready, or even a shared roadmap with other teams if your system is something in between the centralized and distributed model like us. Like we're still in the, somebody calls federated model, but yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of that term. So, when you present those kind of long-term plan and where you wanted to go, it's easier, of course, to, oh, okay, so you're the person to reach out when I have to fix something. And maybe I can even be your supporter, your fan, when it comes to, the big moment like this, like the big reveal of, okay, this is where we want to go with our model. We want to move from a very flexible, integrated solution to something more modular. So, okay, I know what's in your head. I know what's your cooking, because, yeah, I mean, design system in a black box, working in a vacuum, it's totally like the worst decision we could do.
So it's interesting because you have really high stakes. You're in a situation where there's headcount reduction, your resources are ever more constrained. And so everything you have to do has to be geared towards maximum impact. And somehow you figured out a good balance between considering what you can do immediately that provides that impact vis-a-vis these like quick wins, but also have this like almost predictive mindset of what's coming. So you can be well prepared there and show up to like catch that ball as it's thrown to you. Talk to me about how you did that balancing act, because this is really fascinating to me. You're probably hyper focused on like what value can we provide this week, but also really trying hard to think about like what is coming 3 months from now that I should be preparing for so that I'm ready when it hits. How did you find that balance?
I don't know if this is very personal and subjective. We just went rogue. Like we tried to work under the radar, especially because then again, in an organization with that size, with thousands of people, with hundreds of designers, leaking this information is almost like, leaking up the reveal of a product or something. Like you cannot provide false information or over promises on stuff. Maybe we did this mistake a couple of times. We tried to get the hype, and try to overshare what we were trying to achieve. And then, of course, this is something that will never happen for 6 months. And then people get back to us, oh, but I was thinking that you're going to launch this, we're going like with the local systems. And this is something that later we just discovered will never work. We don't have the resources. We don't have we don't have the setup to do that. So I would say that it's just something that maybe it's the only thing that you actually can afford to work without sharing too much, or just working in a vacuum in your black box. And at least on the educational material, I would say, like, it's not like the proposal, it's quite easy to present. The educational material, like, okay, I will start from the very beginning. What is a design system model? What are the examples of a good design system network, and showing the excellence in our industry, in our field. And that's where you have to really start. And you cannot go into technicalities. You have to always stay a little bit above. And that's probably the hardest part. But it's also like maybe the part that you don't have to involve too many people. You just try to squeeze your time on that.
It's interesting how much parallel that has to a lot of the way we think about things in a startup, right? Like the whole idea of being in stealth mode. Wow, you're building something that gets to a level of completeness or readiness that it's ready to go to market, or like, sharing a roadmap, but also having a bunch of things that are ideas that maybe aren't on the roadmap, but are things that you want to be able to do, and trying to understand, how people respond to those things. I think there's definitely a balancing act between this idea of what do you promise in a crisis and what are you realistically able to accomplish, and how that affects your credibility. And that management of that credibility, I assume, was again paramount to you continuing to receive buy-in for you and your team. Were there any moments where you were really concerned about your viability and the ability to keep going?
Everybody feel this moment at least once, is that, okay, this is too much to fix, or this is too much to build on top of the legacy we have, so we should definitely start from scratch. It's mostly like, okay, probably trying to shift what we have another side, or trying to create a new mindset, a new culture about system thinking. It's quite impossible. So let's maybe start from scratch with something new. But usually it creates more hazards than benefits. So if I ask me now, it's definitely more viable to build on what you have, especially because there is always somebody that will stick to your product, especially on big numbers. Then again, on a big organization, a huge community like the one we have, you will always find at least a couple of big supporters, like die-hard fans that you never disappointed. So you can try to build on the people that they actually want to stick with your product, no matter how flawed it is or how updated it is.
Yeah, I mean, has this experience changed your philosophy around tech and design debt? I think that what you just talked about, the idea that like it may feel easier to throw it all away sometimes and start over, but the real answer is that's usually more of a hazard than a benefit. Sticking with those people that are your diehard fans, like playing to your base, maybe, if you will. Like, has that opinion changed at all throughout this process?
In our situation, we were starting with a strong code foundation. So, and this is something that I strongly believe, like, design system, it's the three pillars is still like design, code, and content. And it was just acting like crazy to just ditch and start from scratch. And you could lose the three of them, like all the three pillars. At least one of them is there and it's quite mature, and it's only needs some support from the other twos. So yeah, that's why we stick it with the decision of keep building on what we have. But yeah, definitely, like, there was a moment that's okay, that's too much to handle. We need to start, or at least, when you miss a lot of high level, untangible resources like techniques or a good pattern library, those high level things that really create the direction that you wanted to share with the other teams. You only have a bunch of the tangible elements of the design system, classic UI kit and React library, whatever. But you feel that is always missing the bigger part of the pyramid, of the hierarchy. And you say, like, we cannot just walking like crabs and reverse engineering starting from the components. We need to start fresh with a new mindset, a new culture, and new principles, and start building that. But it's not working like that in reality.
It reminds me of like a hierarchy of needs, right? And so you're anchored very deeply in those foundational concepts, because ultimately you had to have something that continued to secure that buy-in and really prove that value in the organization. And that anchor for you all was code. You just had a robust coded system. And that was something that, like, it sounds like you sort of held sacred, because you could have rebuilt it. And through this crisis, there was even maybe an opportunity to say, like, we need to rethink all this. But ultimately, that core is something you decided not to change. Now, looking back on that decision, do you feel like that was the right call?
We still need to find out, I guess, but definitely helped to at least to gather one of the audience, the 33% of the customer base of the design system, so developers already on board. Like, I think it would be even more difficult to just, stick with new code base or new mental models to try to share with them. It could have been even more complicated. So 1/3 of the audience was already there and we just kept them.
How has that changed the culture of the way your team operates? Because I think a lot of this does relate to a major culture shift. Anytime there's a big operational change like this, the organization was on one pathway, it's now on another, right? And that pathway may be really close to the pathway it was first, but that changes the culture, that changes the mindset of people, that changes oftentimes the mental math that we all do around what our jobs are. Talk to me about that shift in culture. Do you feel like your adaptation of the design systems team was like thoughtful towards that and aligned with that shift in culture? Or do you feel like it kind of ran counter to it?
Yeah, no, I mean, my design system persona, let's say, is mostly like support and be the best customer care I could be, as a teammate. And this is something that I try to share. And I think I succeed the most when I joined the team almost 2 years ago. It was mostly like the shift happened from being a component provider with a very strict model on the design system. So we're just providing the UI kit, providing the code, and then everything else, the entire guidance on governance of the design system, it was just missing. It was on behalf of the units or just the product teams. And we try to move that from the product teams to the design system because people were craving for direction or at least for a unified direction. So they started to reach out to us and they had someone to get support for any kind of questions that goes from the code to design to even sometimes even like questions that were not related to the design system, but mostly like, on tooling or just like something that on collaboration and cross collaboration between units. So it get us talking about buy-in in crisis, a very huge authority on, okay, this is the central hub on how I can just execute faster, how can I do it faster. So this is like the change in mindset that we brought fresh in the team.
It sounds like, at least for now, the situation you find yourself in is one where the changes you made have been largely successful. You've been able to ship a lot of valuable product. You've been able to support this culture. You've been able to have this great balance between the short-term value and the long-term strategic wins. What's next? I mean, oftentimes as, macros are likely to change again in the world in the next 12 months, like, how are you preparing for that next change that you're going to see?
Well, I read a very interesting thing today. It's a great reminder that, change is the only constant in our life. So we are coming from a couple of very big changes, organizational, but also executional, like the change on the visual language, or so many changes at the same time. So we cannot avoid the next change, but we could just find ourselves a little bit more prepared on this, especially on advocate more that this is something that will keep happening on a regular basis. So on what's next, like we only need to get the long-term plan a reality. It's mostly like you cannot just keep the hype over and over. You cannot be one of those video games company that just announced something like 8 years before, So, I mean, piece by piece, we just wanted to fill all the boxes when it comes to, okay, we can provide something that really help new joiner, a veteran, a designer, a coder, a content designer, like great baseline for every unit. And especially like the complexity at Klarna, especially is the broad range of different products from B2C, B2B to website to email design systems or libraries. So this is like the major challenge. Like, how can you just provide something that will help anyone in so many different ways? And this is probably our next step.
I love the focus on fundamentals and just understanding that if those fundamental things are strong in your design system, you'll continue with that buy-in and you'll continue to be able to execute on that balance of tactics and strategy. Well, Francesco, thanks so much for being on the program today. Thanks for sharing a very vulnerable story about navigating a crisis. And I just want to say I really appreciate your perspective.
I mean, this is our very skewed perspective on how we didn't get yet to, all those fancy things that you read on automation or internal plugins. We're still like on that operational style. Then again, it's probably a very old style of doing design system. Like it's still very manual, very people-based, but it was the best way to keep it human.
Awesome. Well, hey, this has been a wonderful podcast. Let's have you back on again in about a year and see where things are at.
Yeah, would be great.
Take care, everybody. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.